4 years ago this week, the worst natural disaster ever to strike this country hit the Texas coast. 6,000 people were killed on Galveston Island in the Great Storm of 1900. Our Charles Hadlock reports tonight some of those who died are now being remembered.
Galveston has never turned its back on the Gulf, but it has put up a wall. For most of this century, the wall has protected the city from powerful hurricanes, but it cannot protect it from the painful memory of what happened here during the Great Storm of 1900. St. Mary's Orphanage was built away from town to isolate the children from the yellow fever and other deadly diseases that had claimed their parents. 10 Catholic nuns ran the orphanage. In the summer of 1900, 93 children lived there. The orphanage was built just a few feet from the sandy beach. On September 8, 1900, the sisters looked out from the orphanage and knew something was wrong.
They could see it coming in, and that they knew the wind was getting higher and higher.
Julia Wilson's father, Frank Madera, was one of the boys in the orphanage. He and the other children were told to prepare for a storm. Earlier that day, Sister Elizabeth Ryan had gone to town to gather provisions. She stopped by St. Mary's Infirmary to visit the sick.
The sisters here at the hospital tried to encourage Sister Elizabeth Ryan to stay. And they said, just wait till after the storm passes. And she said, no, she said, I have to get back to the orphanage. She said, because I have the provisions in the wagon, and if I don't get back, the orphans will have no supper tonight. She didn't know that whether she made it back or not, there would be no more suppers at the orphanage.
The sisters at the orphanage moved the children from the boys' dormitory to the new, stronger girls' building next door.
And they sang an old French hymn called Queen of the Waves. And they sang that song trying to keep the children calm.
With the surf rising, everyone moved to the second floor, including 13-year-old William Murney. Murney had lived in the orphanage only a short time. His mother had just died of tuberculosis, and his father died the very next day of a heart attack. Now, his own life was in peril.
He recounted a long evening of fear, the winds howling, raging, and the water rising. The water came in to the lower floor.
And each sister took a section of rope and tied one end to a child and the other end to the cincture that they wore around their waist. And each sister tied to herself between 6 and 8 orphans.
Suddenly, a giant wall of water crashed into the empty boys' dormitory next door.
And that increased the fears of the children, and they started to scream. And the sisters tried to calm them down and had them again sing Queen of the Waves.
Some of the orphans looked up in time to see a ship smash into the last remaining building at the orphanage.
The orphanage was lifted from its foundation. It floated for a few minutes, and then the roof caved in, trapping the sisters and the children in the water.
The whole building seemed to collapse at once.
William Murney grabbed his younger brother.
He was holding his brother, his 8-year-old brother. And a beam, he thinks a beam hit him, and he never saw his brother again. And he had recollections of being in the cold water, but those were very vague. And he says the real thing that he remembers most was waking up in a tree.
3 boys survived the storm by clinging to a tree. Everyone else died in a watery grave.
One of the scenes he did recall is after he was awakened and was in the tree, seeing some of the bodies of the nuns floating by with 2 or 3 orphans tied to them.
Eventually, the boys were rescued.
Men, he said, were either sailors or people from Galveston that had a small boat that came by and picked them up.
By daylight, the boys could clearly see how truly lucky they were. 6,000 people had died during the night. Many bodies, including those of the nuns and children, were buried where they were found. Others were loaded onto barges and carried out into the Gulf. The young survivors grew up quickly. William Murney lived at St. Mary's Infirmary after the storm and helped the nuns there care for the injured. He later lied about his age and got a job with the railroad. Murney stayed in touch through letters to the other two boys with whom he spent that terrifying night together clinging to a tree. But over time, they drifted apart. Now, 94 years later, the state of Texas is honoring the nuns and children lost in the orphanage. The descendants of the 3 survivors will attend the dedication of a marker placed near the site of the orphanage. The marker sits on the wall that protects the city, but it cannot protect it from a painful memory. Charles Hadlock, 11 News, Galveston.
And that marker will be dedicated Thursday night. Dan has the back to work forecast next.